I still remember the sound before I remember the sight. It was that deep mechanical roar that rattled the coffee mug sitting on my kitchen counter, the kind of noise that tells you somebody out there is either building something or destroying it. I looked through my front window expecting to see another snowplow rolling down the street, but instead all I saw was white. My windows on the first floor were disappearing behind a wall of snow, and standing on top of that growing pile was my neighbor, smiling like a kid who had just won the county fair. He lifted one hand and gave me a friendly little wave while his industrial snowblower kept firing another stream of heavy wet snow straight at my house. That was the moment I realized something. Some people don't start neighborhood wars by yelling or throwing punches. Some people do it with a smile and a machine. Looking back now, I probably should have recognized the warning signs months earlier, because none of this started with snow. It started with pride. My name is Ethan Walker, and I live in a small mountain town in northern Michigan where winter isn't just another season. It's something you prepare for like a military campaign. Around here, everyone owns snow shovels the way people in Florida own lawnmowers. We check weather forecasts the same way other people check stock prices, because one storm can dump enough snow to trap you inside for days if you aren't paying attention. I lived in that house for almost 12 years. It wasn't fancy, but every board, every flower bed, every stone retaining wall represented weekends I'd spent building a life with my late father before cancer took him. The property sat slightly lower than the lot next door, separated by a sturdy retaining wall that stood about 4 feet high. It had never been a problem because every neighbor I'd ever had understood the unwritten rule. You deal with your own snow. Then, Ryan Mercer bought the house next door. Ryan wasn't a terrible guy the day he moved in. He was loud, sure, and liked talking about money more than anyone I'd ever met. But I figured that was just his personality. He'd brag about every purchase like it was an Olympic medal. New truck, new ATV, new smoker, new pressure washer. If it was expensive, Ryan wanted everyone on the block to know about it. So when winter arrived and he proudly rolled out a massive commercial-grade snowblower that looked like it belonged clearing airport runways instead of suburban driveways, nobody was surprised. He spent almost an hour showing anyone who walked by all the horsepower upgrades he'd installed. I even laughed and told him it looked powerful enough to move Canada a few feet north. He grinned and said, "You'll be thanking me when I clear this whole street in half the time." I honestly believed him. The first storm hit right after Christmas, about 14 inches overnight. I woke up early, poured myself coffee, pulled on my boots, and started clearing my driveway the old-fashioned way with my snowblower. Halfway through, I heard Ryan's machine start up. At first, I didn't think much about it until a wave of snow exploded over the retaining wall and slammed into the side of my house. Then another, and another. Within minutes, hundreds of pounds of heavy, wet snow had piled against my siding, covering basement windows and burying shrubs I planted with my dad years earlier. I shut my machine off and walked over. "Ryan," I called, trying to keep my voice calm. "Could you angle that thing the other way? All that snow is ending up against my foundation." He looked at me with the kind of smile people wear when they already know they're about to annoy you. "Not my fault," he said with a shrug. "Wind catches it." I looked around. There wasn't enough breeze to move a paper napkin. "Come on," I said. "You know exactly where you're aiming." He leaned against the machine, folded his arms, and laughed. "Then maybe you should have bought the higher lot." That sentence stayed with me longer than I care to admit. I walked back to my driveway because I knew arguing wouldn't change anything. Still, over the next few weeks, every storm ended exactly the same way. Ryan blasted his snow sideways because it was easier than turning the chute toward his own yard. My foundation disappeared beneath mountains of compacted snow while his property stayed neat and clean. By mid-January, damp spots started appearing along the basement wall. The dehumidifier ran almost non-stop. One afternoon, my friend Lisa stopped by with homemade chili and immediately noticed the moisture stains spreading across the concrete. She frowned, ran her hand over the wall, then looked out the basement window at the frozen wall of snow outside. "Ethan," she said quietly, "when this melts, all that water is coming straight here." I already knew she was right. The problem wasn't the snow itself. It was what came after. I could spend every weekend shoveling Ryan's mess away, but every new storm reset the clock. I wasn't losing because I lacked effort. I was losing because I was fighting the wrong battle. That night, after Lisa left and the house fell silent again, I sat at my workbench in the garage staring at a notebook full of sketches I'd made years earlier for a radiant heating project. My father used to tell me that every problem follows rules. And if you understand the rules, you don't have to be stronger than the problem. You just have to be smarter. As another weather alert flashed across my phone predicting the biggest snowstorm of the season, I closed the notebook, smiled to myself for the first time in weeks, and realized I wasn't going to touch another shovel until I finished building something Ryan would never even notice. The next morning, I drove into town before sunrise with a shopping list that probably would have looked strange to anyone standing behind me in the checkout line. Heavy-duty outdoor radiant heating mats, industrial plastic sheeting, PVC pipe, waterproof connectors, a handful of clamps. The cashier glanced at everything piled on the cart and asked if I was building a greenhouse. I smiled and said, something like that. The truth was I wasn't planning revenge. At least that's what I kept telling myself. I wasn't interested in damaging Ryan's property, getting into a shouting match, or spending the rest of my life fighting with the guy next door. I simply wanted him to experience the natural consequences of creating a problem he refused to acknowledge. There is a difference between hurting someone and letting physics finish a sentence they started themselves. Back home, I spread everything across my garage floor and started sketching again. My father had been a mechanical engineer, the kind of man who believed almost every problem became simpler once you stopped looking at people and started looking at systems. Water always followed gravity. Heat always traveled toward cold. Ice always formed when temperature dropped below freezing. None of those things cared who was right or wrong. They simply obeyed the rules. Ryan had spent weeks creating a mountain of snow against my foundation. I was going to redirect what happened after the mountain began to melt. I waited until dusk before starting the work outside. The retaining wall between our properties cast enough shadow that nobody could really see what I was doing unless they walked directly into my yard. I dug a shallow trench along the edge of the foundation where Ryan's snow always landed, carefully laid the heating mats beneath a protective layer, covered everything with thick plastic sheeting, then angled the plastic just enough to guide meltwater into a concealed PVC pipe. The pipe hugged the retaining wall almost invisibly before ending several feet away at the lowest point beside Ryan's steep asphalt driveway. From the street, it looked like nothing more than another drainage line disappearing beneath the snow. I tested everything with a garden hose before winter reclaimed the ground. Water flowed exactly where I wanted it to flow. I shut the system off, buried every visible section beneath fresh snow, and waited. Waiting turned out to be harder than building. Every few days, another storm rolled through and Ryan repeated the same performance. The roar of that oversized snowblower became part of my morning routine. I would hear the engine, then the heavy thud of wet snow slamming against my siding. Sometimes he would wave. Sometimes he would grin. Once he actually shouted across the wall, "Looks like your house catches snow better than mine." I answered with nothing more than a nod. It bothered him more than arguing ever could. People like Ryan expect resistance because resistance lets them keep playing the game. Silence leaves them wondering what you're thinking. One Saturday afternoon, another neighbor named Carl wandered over while Ryan was clearing his driveway. Carl watched another plume of snow crash against my basement windows before shaking his head. "You ever think about calling the township?" he asked quietly. I shrugged. What would I tell them? That my neighbor's being inconsiderate? Carl sighed. Fair point. He hesitated before adding, "Still, that guy enjoys pushing people." That sentence stayed with me because it explained something I hadn't been able to put into words. Ryan wasn't saving time. He wasn't solving a problem. He enjoyed knowing somebody else had to deal with the consequences of making his own life easier. The forecast finally predicted what meteorologists call the once-in-several-years storm. Nearly 3 feet of heavy snow, followed by a sharp temperature drop. Every local hardware store sold out of salt. Grocery shelves emptied. People rushed to prepare generators and fuel cans. Ryan looked thrilled. He spent half the afternoon outside checking over his machine like a pilot inspecting an airplane before takeoff. Around dawn, the snowfall became so thick I could barely see the street. Through the swirling white curtain, I heard the familiar engine come alive. Then came the impacts, one after another. Dense snow arced over the retaining wall and buried my carefully hidden setup beneath an even larger mountain than I could have hoped for. My basement windows disappeared completely. The shrubs vanished. Even part of the porch railing disappeared beneath the growing pile. Ryan kept going for almost an hour. When he finally finished, he looked toward my house, lifted one gloved hand, and gave me an exaggerated salute before driving his machine back into the garage. I waited another 20 minutes just to make sure he had settled inside. Then I walked into my own garage, looked at the small weatherproof switch mounted beside the workbench, and rested my finger on it for several long seconds. I'll admit something I am not especially proud of. My heart was pounding. Not because I expected anything dramatic to happen immediately, but because this was the point where planning ended and reality took over. I flipped the switch. Nothing happened that anyone could see. No lights, no smoke, no dramatic sound effects. Hidden beneath thousands of pounds of snow, the heating mats quietly began warming the lowest layer. The mountain above stayed frozen while the base slowly transformed into water. Exactly as intended. That water slid across the plastic barrier, collected in the concealed channel, entered the PVC pipe, and disappeared beneath the retaining wall. Outside, the air temperature hovered well below freezing. By the time the water emerged at the outlet beside Ryan's driveway, it spread across the dark asphalt in an impossibly thin sheet before freezing almost instantly into crystal-clear ice. Hour after hour, the process continued. Slow, silent, invisible. Looking out my kitchen window, I couldn't see anything unusual. The driveway looked perfectly ordinary. That was the unsettling thing about black ice. It never announces itself. It simply waits for someone who assumes the ground beneath them is exactly what it appears to be. Around lunchtime, I heard Ryan's garage door rumble open. His SUV rolled backward exactly as it had hundreds of times before. For one brief moment, nothing happened. Then the rear tires reached the lower section of the driveway. The vehicle drifted sideways with almost graceful slowness, as though someone had quietly disconnected it from gravity. Ryan jerked the steering wheel. The tires spun uselessly. The SUV continued sliding until it settled gently into the shallow ditch across the road with more embarrassment than damage. I watched through the window without celebrating. There was no crash, no twisted metal, no injuries. Just a very confused man climbing carefully out of his vehicle while staring at the pavement beneath his boots. He took one step, then another, and suddenly both feet disappeared from under him. He landed flat on his back, stared at the gray winter sky for a second, muttered something I couldn't hear, then slowly rolled over and tried again. This time he crouched low, shuffling forward with both hands stretched toward the ground until finally he gave up and crawled the remaining distance toward his garage, looking less like the confident man who had mocked me for weeks and more like someone negotiating with the laws of nature for the first time in his life. Standing there with my coffee growing cold in my hand, I realized the story wasn't over yet. If anything, it was only now beginning to reach the part neither of us had expected. Ryan spent the better part of 2 hours getting his SUV back onto solid ground. A tow truck eventually pulled up, and from my kitchen window I watched the driver step out, test the surface with one boot, and immediately reach back into his truck for a bag of salt before doing anything else. Even from that distance, I could tell he was asking Ryan what had happened. Ryan pointed at the driveway, then at the sky, then at the ditch, throwing his hands into the air as if winter itself had singled him out for punishment. I almost laughed, but I stopped myself. There wasn't anything funny about seeing another person humbled if you let yourself enjoy it too much. The satisfaction came from something else. For the first time since he'd moved in, Ryan looked genuinely confused instead of smug. Over the next few days, temperatures stayed well below freezing, and every morning he walked out cautiously, checking every step before making his way to the mailbox. The giant commercial snowblower remained parked inside his garage. When another storm rolled through later that week, I heard the familiar engine start, but this time the sound moved in a different direction. I looked outside just in time to see him rotate the discharge chute completely toward his own yard. For the first time all winter, not a single shovelful of snow came over the retaining wall. My basement window stayed visible. My siding stayed clear. My foundation finally had room to breathe. A few days later, we crossed paths while collecting our trash bins. Ryan avoided eye contact at first, then cleared his throat. "Weird ice this year," he muttered. "Never seen anything like it." I nodded slowly. Winter has a way of reminding us that gravity doesn't play favorites. He looked at me for a second, almost as if he suspected I knew more than I was saying. But whatever thought crossed his mind disappeared just as quickly. He simply shrugged, rolled his empty trash can back toward his garage, and that was the end of the conversation. Spring arrived several weeks later, and when the snow finally melted, I removed every piece of the temporary system I'd built. The heating mats went back into storage. The plastic sheeting was folded away. The PVC pipe disappeared into my workshop, where it eventually became part of an entirely different home project. Standing there in the warm afternoon sun, looking at the clean strip of ground beside my foundation, I realized there wasn't any evidence left that the system had ever existed. The only thing that remained was a different relationship between two neighbors. Brian still wasn't especially friendly. He never became the kind of guy who stopped by for coffee or offered to help with yard work. But he also never aimed another ounce of snow toward my house again. Sometimes people don't change because someone convinces them they're wrong. Sometimes they change because the world quietly demonstrates that every shortcut eventually circles back to the person who took it. Looking back now, I don't think the real lesson had anything to do with engineering or heating mats or hidden pipes. It was about patience. I could have screamed across the property line. I could have called the police after every storm. I could have spent the entire winter angry. Instead, I chose to understand the problem before reacting to it. Once I understood how the system worked, I didn't have to overpower Ryan. I simply stopped allowing his decisions to become only my problem. Every now and then, especially after a heavy snowfall, I'll glance over at his driveway and smile to myself when I see every bit of snow neatly piled inside his own yard. He probably tells people he became more careful after that strange winter when black ice seemed to appear out of nowhere. Maybe that's the story he needs to believe. As for me, I sleep just fine knowing I never damaged his property, never threatened him, and never touched his snowblower. I just trusted that the same laws of nature he'd ignored for months would eventually introduce themselves under circumstances he couldn't laugh away. Now I'd really like to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have handled it differently? Would you have called the authorities, kept shoveling in silence, or found your own creative solution? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and I'm genuinely curious where you draw the line between standing up for yourself and getting even. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real neighborhood conflict stories, and share this with someone who's ever had a neighbor who made life just a little harder than it needed to be.